Now, the term resilience is one we hear a lot these days. The current environment challenges our resilience. We need resilience to get through COVID, and of course, kids these days have got no resilience. But what does it actually mean? Well, this was pretty much the first question we asked ourselves. For us, the interest in resilience did stem from our time in uniform, and in particular from seeing what was on paper a pretty resilient bunch of people go through all sorts of stressors on the battlefields and get very different reactions as a result. In the moment, we were seeing a lot of people dealing with these amazing stressors. We're seeing some people rise even further and perform at an exceptional level in the face of stress, and sometimes we're seeing really good people overwhelmed by the stressors that they faced. This was a bit weird because on paper, we were the same human being. In the SAS regiment, we'd been screened for a lot of physical and psychological characteristics that are associated with resilience. We'd done a 3-week selection course that was testing for just this very factor, and we'd had all sorts of training to try to improve that. And yet what we were seeing in the moment and in the days, weeks, and now years that follow exposures on the battlefield was these very different reactions from an ostensibly very similar group of people. It's got us pretty interested in what was it that made someone resilient and how could we get better at this. And so we started to try to develop a model. We looked at all the peer-reviewed scientific literature that we could get our hands on anything to do with resilience or stress. And through that research, we started to get an understanding of how this thing worked. Not satisfied, we bid for and won a federal government research grant to conduct a body of work in conjunction with the University of Western Australia to really put our model of resilience to the test. Well, we're delighted to say that the UWA researchers were able to validate our model. Essentially, they said it didn't suck. And in fact, last year, in 2022, they published a peer-reviewed paper that served as an empirical evaluation of the Resilient Shield model. What we hope to provide through this series of videos is some of the things that we've learnt from this research, as well as the work that we've done with organisations all over the world to help build individual and collective resilience. It's probably useful to start with the obvious question: what is resilience? It's an obvious question, but there's actually no obvious answer. In fact, from an academic perspective, the jury's out on exactly what this thing called resilience means. In essence, we found that there were two large schools of thought. One said that resilience is something that helps you get through the tough times, what the psychologists called maintaining function. That is, you can keep doing what you're supposed to be doing even when things get rough. I reckon that's a pretty good start if we're thinking about what resilience means. But there's also another school of thought about resilience, and this says that resilience is our ability to bounce back. Now, I love this as well because it acknowledges the fact that life can sometimes knock us off kilter. That's okay. Resilience isn't about sucking everything up and just keeping on going regardless. Resilience obviously depends on the stress that we face, and sometimes these stressors do knock us off kilter. That's fine, but resilience is what helps us bounce back. One of the really funny things, as we looked at all of the scientifically validated methods of increasing resilience, was that we were seeing some echoes of wisdom that humans have known for centuries. And in this respect, there's some fantastic old Zen Buddhist philosophy about this idea of bouncing back. Zen Buddhism offers that when it comes to resilience, we want to be like the bamboo and not like the oak. The oak's pretty tough, takes a fair bit to knock it over, but once it's broken, it's proper gone. The bamboo, on the other hand, it does take some knocks, but it always bounces back. And I reckon this is a great way to think about resilience. So with that loose definition in mind, we started to piece together our model, which we've subsequently come to call the Resilient Shield. Now, we love the iconography of a shield. Throughout history, and clearly, particularly in a military context, the shield has provided protection. But we love the mythology around the shield that was championed by the Romans and the Spartans. They would interlock their shields as they advanced into battle, and in this manner, The shield not only protected you, but it protected those around you, the people you loved. We reckon that's a pretty good way to think about your resilience shield. Sure, it provides protection for you, and that's important. But if you've got a strong resilience shield, you're also going to be in a much better position to provide protection for the people you love, your friends, your family, and your colleagues. Within our resilience shield model, we identified that there were 6 key layers. And essentially, this was the crux of our research with the University of Western Australia, who were able to validate that each one of these layers contributes independently and statistically significantly to overall resilience. What does that mean? Well, it basically means you just need to keep a bit of an eye on each of these layers. We don't want to let any one go as we go through our lives. So what are the layers? Well, the first is the innate layer. This recognises that each one of us has inbuilt resilience as we stand here today, as a combination of our genetics and our epigenetics, of our nature and our nurture. This can be all sorts of things, from the makeup of our DNA, which can have a bearing on how resilient we are, through to the experiences that we've had through our life, particularly in adolescence, but also through our military service. Each one of these and how we've dealt with it, the environment that we've had to support us through it or otherwise, can have a bearing on the resilience as we stand here today. There's a couple of important things to remember about the innate layer. The first is that it's not particularly modifiable. We can change the way we view some of these experiences, but clearly we can't go back in time to change the experience themselves, nor can we change our DNA yet. But with that in mind, what we do want to recognise within the innate layer is that everybody is different. And therefore it's really toxic, in my opinion, to try to compare individual reactions, even against the same stressor. We tended to do this a bit in the military. We'd look at a situation, we'd see everyone else was doing fine, and we'd look at ourselves and say we're having some issues and maybe feel there was something wrong with us. Or perhaps the other way around. We feel fine after a stress, but we'd look at someone else who is having issues and maybe think there was something wrong with them. That's completely the wrong way to look at it. It's not an apples for apples comparison, and we need to recognise from the innate layer that everybody's different. Now, if we can't modify the innate layer very rapidly, the next 4 layers we certainly can. The mind layer is all about everything that goes on within our head that contributes to our resilience. It's everything psychological or spiritual that helps us get through tough times. It's things like our mindset, the way we perceive the world, the way we deal with and interpret information that we're presented. And it's also things like mindfulness and meditation practices, our ability to focus and to block out negative or distracting, counterproductive sort of thoughts. The body layer is all about our physiological components of resilience. It's about the things we put into our body, what we do with it, how we use it, how we rest it, how we allow it to recover. And this has a massive bearing on our resilience. I'm sure I'm telling you nothing, that if you're run down physically, it has a bearing on your mood and your well-being. And so we want to pay good attention to the body layer of our resilience shield. The next layer is our social layer. And this is the resilience benefits we get from our relationships with other people. And in particular, those relationships where we can be vulnerable and authentic, where we can be our absolute, warts and all, authentic self. If we've got these kind of relationships in our lives, it's likely that we're going to be benefiting from the social layer of our resilience. Unfortunately, not everyone does. Loneliness is a problem. And sometimes the way we use social media can actually make our social layer weaker rather than strengthen it. Within the social layer, we focus on tools that can help improve the quality of these relationships and the resilience that we get from interacting with other human beings. And the final modifiable layer is the professional layer. This is what we do on a day-to-day basis. For some of us, that's going to be work. For others, studies. Others, potentially volunteer work. It's how we fill our day. And it's important within these activities that we find 2 things. One is virtuosity. We don't need to be the world's best at what we do on our day-to-day basis, but we do need to have some level of competence and ideally we do need to feel that we're progressing or getting better at it. And the second thing we need to get within our professional layer is purpose. It is absolutely critical that we can find some sort of meaning in what we're doing during our day-to-day activity. The other really interesting component of our professional layer is how it interacts with our identity. Many of us, in a military context, found a lot of identity in being a member of the Australian Defence Force. Unfortunately, sometimes as we transition out, particularly if this has happened suddenly or at a time when we didn't necessarily want it to, this identity can get very lost in that transition. We need to recognise that military service has been an important part of our identity. No one's going to take that away from you, and indeed it provides some amazing capabilities and life lessons that you can carry with you for the rest of your years. But if your identity was solely tied up in wearing that uniform, then the transition period can be a bit rocky. And so within the professional layer, we want to recognise where do we find our professional identity. And often doing something bigger than ourselves, something with purpose, a job or an activity with meaning can fulfil that very requirement. And the final layer of the Resilience Shield is a bit of a bonus layer. It's the adaptation layer. It recognises that the resilience we develop against the known and knowable stressors in our life is actually transferable to those unknown, the black swan events that come out of nowhere and can knock us for six. The adaptation layer really encourages us to look at how we can develop resilience in the other 5 layers, how we can develop the tools and capabilities that can get us through our day-to-day struggles, because these are going to give us the best platform to face that novel, unexpected or unforeseen challenge. The adaptation layer also recognises that those skills we learned in the military that helped us get through those tough times while we were serving can also be adapted to help us get through the new challenges that we may face in our post-service career. Again, it's not about ditching that military identity, but it is about adapting it and finding where it fits into our post-service life. So that's the Resilience Shield model. In the videos that follow, we're going to take a bit of a deeper dive into each of those layers and really try and identify what are some of the high payoff interventions that you might consider building into your life to help improve your Resilience Shield.